I'm certainly annoyed that Trump is using the US military as his personal toy soldiers in Iran just to drive up adrenaline of his supporters. But on the other hand, I was relieved that he didn't choose Canada or Denmark as his target, because that would really send the world economy into the toilet, and NATO will completely break apart. Putin would have a field day in Ukraine, and China would probably start invading Taiwan, and God knows what North Korea would be doing. But now I'm kind of relieved, because if Trump has so much trouble taking Iran, at least Canada and Greenland will be safe. And the scenario where NATO countries bomb each other with AI missiles will probably not happen anytime soon. That's a relief, right? Keep in mind that Iran was definitely not Trump's first choice. If it was totally up to him, he would definitely go for Canada or Greenland first, because territorial expansion is just way too enticing for a narcissistic reality TV personality like him. And as a conqueror, he can convince all the manosphere idiots that he's the king of the world and deserves unlimited power. That's what he dreams about every night, not some drone fight in the Middle East. But he eventually chose Iran because, fortunately, he's still not powerful enough to make totally unilateral decisions. There's still Congress, there's still the press and the internet, and even the useless Supreme Court occasionally rules against him. And most importantly, there are still elections coming up. Waging a war against an ally is just way too risky electorally. So this actually serves as an anecdotal evidence for the so-called democratic peace hypothesis. Some people call it a theory, but political scientists can't agree on the logic behind it. So what they largely agree on is the empirical pattern that they observed. Because it's empirical, I like to call it a hypothesis instead of a theory. But let me quickly explain what this hypothesis says. Firstly, you need to know how political scientists define democracy. On social media, people like to define democracy in a super idealistic way. I keep hearing people say Western countries aren't democratic because they don't really serve the people. Something like that. Well, that's a reasonable sentiment. But for empirical science purposes, if you define democracy that way, you will never find a qualified case. Then the term is no longer useful, because we can't empirically study something that doesn't exist. Like, you can't publish a scientific paper about life in heaven, right? Because nobody has ever seen heaven. So for scientific purposes, we have to define democracy in a way that can help us categorize existing countries. So most political scientists define democracy in a technical way. It doesn't require a country to be good or effective or healthy. It only requires certain measurable features. Namely, the decision makers have to be chosen in competitive elections and as a result be replaced regularly. That's the definition I will use for this video. Please don't fight me on this, because you're free to use other definitions in other contexts. Okay, but for the purpose of this video, I use the normal political science definition. Okay? So the democratic peace hypothesis says that countries that are technically democratic, holding competitive elections, normally don't invade each other. It does not claim that democracies are more peaceful or less belligerent or less warmongering. No, it does not claim those. It simply says even if a democracy acts like an asshole all the time, it probably would not invade another democracy. So empirically, it's holding up pretty well. The CIA, of course, in the 60s and the 70s, was involved in some coups against elected governments. But those were not exactly invasions. Those were bad, no doubt, but they were covert operations carried out by a small number of operatives with a moderate budget. They were bad, sure, but you can't count them as wars or invasions. So democracies can do bad things, but they somehow magically avoided wars against each other. Maybe you can find one or two borderline counterexamples, but very rare. So why don't they fight? There's no academic consensus, but you can kind of see some clues from the Trump administration's war choices. If they attack Canada or Greenland, first of all, the public opinion would eat them alive. And also, the Iranian government has very few international allies and not much support from its own people either. But if you invade a democracy, that will be pitting yourself against a much larger number of countries and a much larger group of people. I'm not going to go over all the possible theories. Okay, you can easily find them on the Wikipedia page, or better still, search the topic in Google Scholar. A fascinating topic, and still with no consensus. But even though we don't have a solid theory, we know the pattern is strong. It's like even before Isaac Newton, people already knew which direction apples would drop. Right? Even then, people would put their baskets below the apples, not above them. Right? So sometimes we don't need established theories to trust an empirical pattern. So democratic peace is not quite as reliable as falling apples, but pretty reliable. It means if in some distant future all countries start holding competitive elections, we will probably see very few wars. Okay? So let's try to work toward that future.